Okay, welcome to Bible Basics number 11. Last week I talked about, hopefully you watched and listened, an introduction to modern biblical scholarship. It's a distinct phenomenon. And I'm going to talk more about modern biblical scholarship today. But last week we talked about the separation that occurred in modern times between the academy or colleges and universities on the one hand and church on the other, whereas in ancient times there was no distinction between the two. The scholars that we heard from were all connected to local churches and part of it. Back then the churches there was not a single hierarchical organization of the church. That came later. Mainly, first stage was after Constantine became a Christian, there were councils that were held where bishops from all over the known world would come together and discuss things. And then they would split apart in the 11th century, with Roman Catholic Church being half and the Greek Orthodox Church being the other half, basically divided into East and West, the former Roman Empire. But back then, as I say, in times when the New Testament was being written and when it was being formed, the scholars that we hear from were associated with these churches, and sometimes with specialized groups or institutions. But for the most part, they worked together. Whereas today they're entirely separate. I mean, the biblical scholarship section of the faculty of a major university has no connection to a church. That's like an anathema to them today. We also talked about Charles Lyell, who introduced into science and pressed for science to sort of shove God out. And sometimes when he wrote about it, he actually used language very much like that. But most of the time, they don't speak of it that way. But they wanted a different way, frankly, a more secular way, or to put it more bluntly. And Charles Darwin came and filled the gap that Lyell created. Lyell said that, the nature of the sediment and settlement of sediment that we see in nature wasn't caused by the flood. It was caused by millions of years of the processes that we see in place right now. And life went from, with God, all things are possible, to, with time and chance, all things are possible. And modern scholarship became very secularized, not just religious scholarship, but all scholarship. And Charles Darwin filled that gap with his theory of evolution. So today, I want to talk about the dominance of modern biblical scholarship. It has really come to dominate the academic scene, such that even believers who have PhDs or master's degrees or whatever are expected to do their biblical analysis without respect to their beliefs in those things. In other words, you're supposed to be able to, they're supposed to write about the Old Testament and the New Testament without saying whether or not they believe Moses was of God or Jesus was of God. And there's come to be a way of, well, first let me say there's this concept of methodological naturalism. Of course, the natural world is what we can contact with our five senses. The supernatural world, or the unseen dimension, is that which cannot be contacted with the five physical senses. When science first began as a modern discipline, it was led by people like Isaac Newton, Johannes Kepler, and these were not just believing men, but devout men, and they saw themselves as discovering what God had created, and that because God was a God of order and that he was a God of consistency, that's why we could observe physical processes in place and trust that they have been in place and they will be in place, so that they could begin to make predictions and inferences both about the future and the past. Now, the difference is, as the Bible tells us, there was a time when all these processes started. It was that week of creation. Adam and Eve were created on the sixth day. The seventh was a day of rest. And so, these processes had a very definite beginning. And if you count the clock from where we are now and use the Bible and look at the genealogies and sort of compute it, it looks like it goes back to about 4000 BC. If you put Jesus Christ in the middle, all time since then, been a couple of thousand years. Time before him looked to be about 4,000 years. But under methodological naturalism, you throw all that out. It's methodological in that you follow that method, even if you say, well, but I believe the Bible. I believe there was a creation week. I believe, therefore, the earth is thousands of years old, not billions, millions, and billions of years old. And so you're expected in these major colleges and universities to use methodological naturalism, even if you believe that there is a supernatural dimension, an unseen dimension. So that's how dominant this way of thinking became. And that was really the second wave of the scientific revolution. The first wave, including people like Newton and Kepler, that didn't have this secularization in mind. But people like Lyell and Darwin and others brought that about. And specifically with respect to biblical interpretation, there came to be this methodology called historical criticism. They wanted to be critical. They wanted to be skeptical of claims. Now, I personally I don't buy into the rationale for that at all. And a lot of people don't buy into it at all. But as I say, it's dominant. But I don't teach at a university, so I don't have to be dominated by it. And, for example, we've got the scriptures that come from Moses. Now, I'm a Gentile. I wasn't raised in a Jewish home, so I wasn't raised to have reverence for Moses per se. But I was raised in a Christian home, and I kind of wandered away from whatever faith I had when I was a teenager, roughly for about 10, 15 years, from the time I was, say, 11 or 12, maybe 13 at the most, to the time I was 26 or 27. I was agnostic about those kinds of things. I didn't know. But when I was around 26 years old, I started reading the Bible for myself, specifically, the whole thing, but mainly the New Testament. And I came to realize that Jesus Christ was either who he said he was, or he was a liar, or he was a lunatic, as is said. And it was obvious from what he said that he believed the account of Moses. He believed in the creation account. He believed that in the beginning, God made them male and female. It wasn't like billions of years ago, he created some primordial goo, and from that, millions or billions of years later, people somehow evolved, and the sexes evolved and all that. No, he made them male and female from the very beginning. That's what Jesus believed. Therefore, I don't have to be skeptical about those claims, and I don't have to prove all those Old Testament claims one by one. If Jesus said he believes the Old Testament, and he talks about things like Noah's flood and about Jonah, and he talks about them as history and not as myth, then I believe that. I don't have to reason it out any more than that. I don't have to become a scientist and go study these things. Now, there are scientists who believe in Jesus who do study these things. There's a ministry called Answers in Genesis. They've got an ark, a Noah's Ark replica in Kentucky, and they've got a creation science museum. And, more power to them. I think that's great. And if you have a scientific leaning and want more scientific explanations and reconciliations of the Bible, then those resources are there for you. But for me, Jesus' word is enough. And besides that, I also read the Bible, and I just can see no way to reconcile evolution with it. There's no way. And anyway, this historical criticism kind of ignores people like me and says, no, we got to check everything out, and we can't accept anything on faith. Well, I'm fine with going to the Bible without faith and just seeing and checking it out. That's what I did. I went to the Bible and checked it out. Specifically, I went and checked out Jesus. I checked out the New Testament, what it said about him. I've checked it out multiple times since. I've examined it. I've looked at its history, where the New Testament come from, who wrote it. I've looked at all that, and I'm sharing these things about it in these videos that I'm making, so that you can have the benefit of what I've learned. And I haven't learned anything special from them. What I found is available to everyone, but not everyone has the time to go do that. And I had the time at various points in my life to do that. I got a couple of seminary degrees, and so I sort of learned my way around the library and how to find things out. And even apart from that, just having a college degree and going to high school and grammar school, I learned how to use an encyclopedia, and I can use Wikipedia. I can use other resources, some even more reliable than Wikipedia. But this methodological naturalism dominates biblical scholarship today. Historical criticism is skeptical, and so, for example, they won't listen to the ancients. But the ancients told us who wrote all the books, for example, in the New Testament. Scholars that lived between the 1st century and the 4th and 5th centuries told us how the apostles would write these documents. They would be collected and preserved by the congregations that they wrote to. They would be copied. Everything was hand copied back then. They would hand copy them and send them around to other churches. And so through that means, these writings, these New Testament writings, became widely distributed throughout the Roman Empire, and then passed on from generation to generation. And that's how we know, just like we know which recipe is Aunt Millie's recipe for German chocolate cake, because Aunt Millie's family kept them and testified that this was her recipe. Or in the case of these New Testament writings, who wrote which one. But modern biblical scholars know they won't do that. Now, there are liberal and conservative modern biblical scholars. And so the conservative ones are more likely to believe that the original ascriptions, authorship ascriptions to the New Testament. But they have to sort of soft pedal that, because it's the liberal scholars that dominate the academic institutions, and a conservative scholar is not going to get very far in them. Now, there's a few denominational seminaries and where things are a little bit different. They take what's called a confessional stance, and they're allowed to be more faith-oriented. But the degrees they hand out generally aren't respected by the Ivy League institutions or even the major state institutions. Things have changed an awful lot in the last 200 or 300 years as a result of the Enlightenment and that sort of thinking that came out. And that's how we've got a world that believes in evolution and a world that doesn't believe you can know who wrote the New Testament books. And because they don't believe you can know it, they don't believe you can know very much for sure about Jesus. And this is what we're up against in the world today. And it's why I'm taking the time to talk about it, because you're going to run into people who have been indoctrinated, who've been brainwashed by this type of thinking. And you need to have a much more practical, common sense way of understanding the Bible and where it came from. So we'll pick it up there next time. In the meantime, keep reading your Bible every day. I'll help you. Just follow my website and I'll show you how to do it.